What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at a roguelike TRPG known as Rogue Waters. Now, this is a game that was brought to my attention by you, the viewers, as it released a little over a week ago back on September 30th, and since then I've been inundated with requests to check it out. And a couple of days ago, the developer of the game, Ice Code Games, reached out and asked if I was interested before sending over a key for it. Now, generally, as someone who covers a lot of TRPGs, what I really enjoyed about this game in particular is how quick and snappy a lot of the tactical battles are, including a few phases with things like ship-to-ship combat, etc. So ultimately, I decided to go ahead and review this one, mostly because I have a few days here where I can kill some time before other things pop up. And this one doesn't seem terribly long, probably like 30-ish hours if I were to ballpark it. But let's get fully into this. So in Rogue Waters, we ultimately play as Captain Cutter, a pirate who was betrayed, which ultimately cost him his life, before being resurrected as a sort of immortal ghost pirate, it would seem, who's going to lead a crew against your former captain, Blackbone. And we're going to do most of this by simply conducting raids. But luckily, we get some extra powers from the sea to help us out with that, in addition to our ship and just general piracy. This came about because the reason we were betrayed by Captain Blackbone is that during an expedition to a temple they found some special gem, which ultimately wound up lodged in your character's eye, giving them some connection to an old sea goddess who has, through this stone, given you the power to call upon sea monsters, like a kraken for instance. This was a power Blackbone was after, and tried to kill you over it. You go missing for 14 years before washing up in a pirate cove, which then acts as your hub where you'll be upgrading your ship with an old crew that also wants to get back at Captain Blackbone. And thus we set about doing that, which comes down to conducting those raids I mentioned, which is going to give us access to glass, blueprints, and a crew ultimately. And then we can spend those currencies on upgrades to our starting equipment for ships, etc. on each roguelike run. So let's talk about the raids themselves. As you might imagine, this is the roguelike portion of the game. On each raid, you're going to start out on your ship with your starting equipment before sailing off in a general direction as objectives come up before you. These can be things like standard battles, shops where you can either repair your ship or get it outfitted with new cannons, buy items for your characters, etc. And while I will save some of the specifics of that for the actual review, the main thing I wanted to talk about here in particular was how they managed to make the combat interesting and fun and pulling some strategy into it. So combat first starts with a ship-to-ship battle in most cases. There are some where it will jump straight to the tactical screen, but typically you start out ship to ship. And this is going to see you spending command points on utilizing your cannons to target different parts of the enemy ship while they do the same to you. Now typically you can try to counter what they're doing by, say, destroying their cannons first, but that takes command points away from you and your ability to fire on their modules and crew. Modules are battle-wide buffs to your characters for that particular fight. This can be things like automatic healing, extra armor, movement, max HP, etc. So you're typically going to want to target those in order to, of course, prevent the enemy from using them on any given battle. However, you can also target the actual crew as well, potentially thinning their numbers before you jump over to their ship, which I have so far found relatively important in some runs just because you can be vastly outnumbered if you don't do this. Now, to make this a little more interesting, you'll gain cannons and things as you move through a run potentially, and each of these cannons has a different damage range as well as what parts of the enemy ship it can actually hit, and whether or not it costs 0, 1, or even 2 command points to actually use, and a lot of your upgrades, unsurprisingly, come down to this in particular. But after 3 rounds of that, you then go into the actual tactical battle with whatever buffs and crew members are left on both sides. Which is probably a good time to mention that the game has a run-specific difficulty level where you can take on more and more challenging difficulty modifiers that ultimately increase the rewards, which is pretty standard for roguelikes. But important to mention when you're looking at the actual tactical screen for sure. And what I really like about this combat system is, again, just how quick it is while also maintaining a fair bit of strategy at the same time. Your team, and the enemies really, is divided up into your main character, your specialists, and your generic crew members. Generic crew members are the simplest units. They basically get to move and attack barring any equipment, or bonuses I should say, from your ship. Your specialists are characters that you will hire in your pirate cove to take along with you via glass. Your specialists and yourself will have a class and skill tree associated with them, so you can, over the course of the game as they gain experience, upgrade and tailor them to suit your needs. And each of these classes, of course, does interesting things, like for instance, a spear maiden can attack more than one enemy in a line, a brawler can actively pick up and throw enemies around, which is important for damage, which we're about to talk about, and then assassins get access to attacks that can just instantly finish off wounded enemies without actually having to spend their turn. As a few examples, now all of these characters can be modified by equipment, things that you can add on to your character to, of course, provide extra effects such as a long-ranged weapon, extra armor, HP, movement, you name it. Now generally, for each character's turn, and it is team-based by the way, each individual unit will be able to move and attack, which is pretty basic, but this is where it gets a little more interesting because the game has a big emphasis on positioning. Each ship you're on might have various environmental things you can interact with, such as a rope to greatly increase your movement speed, spike traps to throw enemies into or be thrown into, getting knocked off a ledge, etc. All things you have to watch out for, especially because bumping into things or enemies often causes extra damage, which you need to exploit to take out enemies very quickly. Because typically when you attack an enemy, they get pushed back and you move forward into their square. And paying attention to that, especially on a ship that is on fire, for instance, is important to minimize the damage to yourself. Now, if your characters go down and lose all their health, you'll be able to call in backups if you have any, but those characters that went down acquire a wound, which reduces their max HP for the run and then has to be healed over time in between runs so they don't lose their effectiveness overall or fully die. But much like you, the enemy has its own classes and makes pretty good use of them. They've got things like snipers, buff characters that add damage to other ones, grenadiers who are throwing bombs at you that you can potentially pick up and throw back, and there's a lot of interplay between classes and their abilities and things in a way that is very fun. But luckily most of the HP totals and everything are kept pretty well in check, so a lot of these battles actually play out very quickly. But just to add a little extra fun to it, they brought in sea monsters, which, as I mentioned, our character has control over these monsters to a minor degree, being able to spend a temporary resource based on a per-run basis in order to call in a sea monster to a battle, such as a kraken to wipe out a bunch of enemies really quickly. Later on, you get a mermaid that can push enemies around, or a snail that will cause traps on deck, etc. And while these are relatively limited in use, they feel great to use and add a really fun element to this overall. So, broadly speaking, as I move to actually review this one, I will say that Rogue Waters is a lot more interesting than I initially gave it credit for, and I can see why people were asking me to check it out so readily, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with it over the coming days while we wait for other releases as well. But I think that is pretty much everything I've got to say about Rogue Waters at this particular moment, though I would love to hear what you have to say about it down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.